Right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first installment of ETS's faculty lecture series. I'm going to invite Dr. Harris, seminary president, to give us a brief welcome.
Good afternoon. And welcome to ETS. We're delighted to have you here today, and this will be the first of a series of lectures by our distinguished faculty. And so we're just delighted to see you here, and hopefully you have a great time today and go back and tell others about the excellence of our faculty and the lectures. Dr. Perkinson is the lead, and I know he will be just top 10. So again, welcome. And please let us know that you can do anything to help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Just a few notes. If you brought your lunch, you feel free to eat. I'm going to be giving you my peanut butter sandwich in just a minute here.
And I will take a tithe out of your lunch when I get done.
This is only time, so that's more incentive to eat all of them during the lecture. Our next lecture will only be in 3 weeks because we had to postpone this for a week. So Wednesday, February 2nd, Dr. Elaine Dells will be talking about her field of theological aesthetics and what role beauty does or does not play here. She's maybe going to be asking us to consider other values than beauty. She'll be sharing some works of art that aren't necessarily all that beautiful, but which still provide an experience of beauty. And the lecture will move towards a reflection on how our aesthetic experience of the world around us can influence what and how we love. So I'm excited for that on February 22nd. We'll be setting more communication out about that. So keep your eye out for it. Hope you can join us then. Our speaker today, as most of you know, is Dr. James Perkinson. Dr. Perkinson is professor of ethics and systematic theology at ETS. He's been an instructor at the seminary for more than 25 years. He was my first professor here at ETS. Dr. Perkinson is a nationally renowned speaker, activist, and poet whose work covers topics as diverse as theological readings of hip hop, the ethical imperatives of climate change activism, the continuing impacts of colonialism, racism, and capitalism, and how we as a species can use the knowledge of our past to find a way to live sustainably in the world. His most recent book is Political Spirituality for a Century of Water Wars. The Angel of the Jordan meets the Trickster of the Trump. A book that Professor Mike Wallace has called a superb eco-anarchist reading of biblical stories against the backdrop of the corporate and racist water politics within the Motor City region of today. Not many of us are so fortunate as to have our work referred to as eco-anarchists. Today, Dr. Perkinson will help us explore surviving the apocalypse. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. You can hear okay with the mic? All right, that's good. Standing back there is muffled. Out there, it's a little better. So I'm going to assume that you all came with at least a little interest in the advertised topic. And I came prepared to do this different ways, to do it freestyle, extemporaneous, to do it in the form of a sermon, or to do it a little more academically, making use of a piece I wrote a couple of years ago that I actually am going to use, but I'll do it performatively. And because it really does have all the elements that we advertise this for. So put up with me for about between 15 and 20 minutes doing that, and then we'll go back and forth. And I'll come and eat anything that's still out there. We live in an apocalyptic hour. COVID-19 would seem to be initiating an end of the world experience that will likely prove serial and recurrent. It is a plague predictive of more to come, viral, bacterial, epoch. And it is a cataclysm not alone affecting humans, not alone microbial and epidemic, but significant of upheaval across an entire planet, witnessing catastrophic change in virtually every major domain: atmospheric, hydrospheric, biospheric, even lithospheric. A cascading of endings with perhaps little respite in between. But for Christians, apocalypse is also quintessentially unveiling, a time of seeing what has been covered over, revelatory, when emerging as backtalk on the part of those under assault. What is often missed in Christian uptake of this particular political premonition, however, is the question of the agent of the discovery, the unveiling. As with so many other Christian conceits about things theological and ultimate, the presupposition is that God is both the hand that is pulling the drape string on the veil and the wizard behind the curtain, who is being revealed. But Toto, the Kansas we are not in, is also most assuredly not some utopic or mysterious domain removed from Earth. Nor is it a hall of mirrors of a crafty con man, using mechanics as magic. We indeed live in an apocalyptic hour, but the agents of comeuppance are neither preeminently human, despite Anthropocene self-importance. Some scholars accord modern humans as now a power supposedly writing ourselves into the geologic record, the rock record, nor transcendentally divine. Biblical unveiling is both by and of the wild. Nature, in her expansive refusal to be entirely colonized by either human technique or human word, revealing the other world as always simultaneously this world. The wild as a category has indeed emerged as a problematic perception of settler colonial imagination of pristine nature apart from human involvement, often in the set-asides of national parks, in utter disregard for long-standing indigenous presence and successful co-dwelling. But it also points to the reality of the planet existing without human presence for billions of years before we arrive very late on the scene, and will be used here in this latter sense of an interdependent agency of the natural world capable of acting quite apart from human design or intentionality. Yes, indeed, planetary heating and climate upheaval are gathering force as a titanic dimension of natural rebuttal of modern human hubris in trying to remake the Earth in our own image. Perhaps the paramount sign of that hubris is the newly invented phenomenon that we call garbage. What we do with a huge fraction of our own species, enslaved and or disappeared under various terms of supposed reduction as savage, criminal, black, illegal, terrorist, queer, poor, refugee, poor, etc. We likewise do with a 1,000-fold greater disregard for the entire planet as merely expendable thing or disposable resource. Like Black or Native folk, the Earth herself is effectively abused, used up, whited out, and thrown away. A Cherokee Irish friend of my wife puts it thus: this great blue-hued beauty, whose gifts we continuously enjoy as bounty, has long been intoning underneath the louder and necessary media cries of our moment, me too. Or as another seer has recently underscored, in the beginning was water. In the end, there will be plastic. We act as if the Earth herself can be sent back to the factory or discarded in a landfill. or trundled with packaging and restraint to offer up as our ram in the thicket, like Abraham of Holy Writ, going bail for all the Isaacs we still wish to acknowledge as sons and kin, even as we continue to deport myriad Hagars and offspring back to the global south as out of place. But who is the we in this admittedly wanton diatribe? A now globalized colonial system that invests ever greater numbers of our species in its ravishments and elaboration. At the heart of this juggernaut of consumption rolling over the planet is a lifestyle payload in technology. The competition mechanism of global capital gives us the market as mobile altar, putting up for sacrificial production or transubstantiation. Whatever wild thing might briefly pleasure and entertain elite fancy and fatuity of concern, or grant the masses greater convenience and an imagined semblance of that elite style and couture. And then we dispose of the same as refuse. And as climate extremity now inflates and desperation grows, the resolve of this cabal of political class and corporate interests to colonize, control, dispossess, privatize, militarize, police, drone, incarcerate, and evacuate can only grow more intense, consuming and discarding in the process both peoples and the rest of the planet. But there's an unholy secret about such discards. They too have an afterlife, even if seemingly out of sight and supposedly dead. They resurrect in an elsewhere, but they do not fly off to heaven. They remain earthbound, recycling and regenerating. They come back around where they have gone around, like plastic in oceans or particulates in air, or indigenous folk, yet honoring kin. And the trick of apocalypse as recitation and act, with regard to this ever-proliferating ensemble of wild beauty diced into decimated discard, is to bring all of these disappeared back on stage in terms of both voice and agency. Biblical apocalyptic hints, a troubling polemic for the eventuality today. In ancient texts and in contemporary reality, it is clearly natural forces and beings that are appearing as the signs of wild communication and agents of divine liberation. Their voice, in addition to their own messaging as flood, drought, fire, and virus, is the indigenous. But the liberation they champion is emerging as omen and repudiation. And the bonds that are being loosed are us. Far from some kind of hoped-for vindication, nature today would seem to be organizing to liberate herself from modern humanity, if we persist in our insistence that we alone matter. Indeed, from the biblical point of view, climate upheaval could be comprehended as the slowly coalescing Moses dictum delivered 3,000 years ago to the gathered tribes of Deuteronomy occupying opposing mountains. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your descendants may live long. The witness of last resort in the case of wild nature against out-of-control humanity in the biblical uptake is the victim plaintiff herself, earth, heaven, as the ultimate spirit incarnating flesh at stake in the aggression. The soil, water, air, cloud, plant, and animal being that is God's body, assuming local shape and potency in bioregional interdependence, giving axial orientation in water flows, linked in global weather and planet-wide geologic and hydrologic transference of matter. That is now the ultimate prophet. When more human voices, think Tecumseh of late or Winona LaDuke today, have been written off as tendentious or irrelevant. This is a phase we dare not hide from in a cleft of suburban gated community rock, whether first world or global south located in its secessionist bend, but must look squarely in the eye and see and respond to with recognition. Such a facing is trumpeted by the biblical text in various genres, but perhaps most instructively for our contemporary dilemma in the mode of myth. For instance, the parable of Jonah. Against the background of James C. Scott's recent work, Against the Grain, tracing the depth of our modern syndrome of flight away from natural accountability back to the Bronze Age Mesopotamian turn towards state organization and coercion, this ancient fish encounter supplies a wild trickster caution for speaking truth to power today. Though not itself narrated in the genre of apocalyptic, the vocational task and terror of this short oracle's major character, Jonah, was precisely one of being called to announce apocalypse to imperial Nineveh. The recounted resistance Jonah exhibits to that prophetic calling speaks loud today. The story that goes by his name riffs on his recalcitrance repeatedly at every turn, unveiling an initiatory schooling in wild teaching and provision. A spirit wind blowing off the Adriatic coast that resists the prophet's nautical flight, a steam that swallows, a fish that saves. Very interesting in Jonah. You read carefully, Jonah's cranking belly of the fish, not for deliverance, but giving thanks because he's already delivered. The fish is the agent of saving in that story. Imperially domesticated cattle who nonetheless fast and mourn once the prophet finally does speak. You read what happens when he goes up in the Nineveh. It's not just the people, it's the cattle that respond. A desert that hosts, after he goes into the city and speaks finally, he goes off to the desert. A gourd plant that shades, a worm serpent and east wind that attack, a night that nourishes, and finally, a God who is moved, not by Jonah, but by both enemies, the Ninevites, and cattle. It ends with God saying, I'm going to take care of all this because the cattle respond. As the last word of divine concern for the one who orchestrates the event. Each of these non-human actors will disclose unanticipated decolonizing potency in the traces of ancient indigenous pre-state floodplain memory haunting their appearance in the Jonah story, pointing towards indigenous savvy of our own as the myth, wisdom, and political will requisite in our day to engage the monstrosity of hubris and destruction the rest of our species has unleashed on the planet. That indigenous witness is ubiquitous if we bother to look, even in our late hour, whether Standing Rock insistence on water protection rather than political protest in 2016, or Ojibwa water walking ritual circumnavigation of the Great Lakes Basin of late, at a Vicey forest commitment in central Indian mountains, as recounted in Arundhati Roy's Walking with the Comrades, or Manobo tribal intelligence living sustainably with the crocodile-spirited wetlands of a Gusan marsh in the Philippines, as my Filipino wife has experienced on a recent visit. Small farmer tree planting across the Sahel in Africa, seeking to halt growing desertification by locally initiated reforestation, or black-led efforts to recover plant medicines native to the strait called Detroit, just outside my front door. What is being unveiled as liberative in this hour, I would argue, is an eco-symbiotics, privileging indigenous recognition of the personhood and wisdom of the wild as both mother and teacher of whatever future remains to our particular species. Though such a small-scale focus, looking to non-human agents and ancestral remnants of survival skill might seem irrelevant to the orange bellowing recrudescence of white supremacy in this country and far right turning to neo-fascism here and abroad, bees and mosquitoes and bacteria and viruses belie the ready dismissal of the literal. Apocalypse as a counsel is not about despair, but vigilant attendance on what at first blush seems ridiculously small and inadequate. Like a peasant resistance movement in the outback of Galilee long ago, where a gathering of grandmothers and kin refusing to vacate their land in North Dakota more recently. Apocalypse convenes a kaleidoscopic stage for the unveiling of the caterwauling forces that some cultural codes rightly excoriate as colonial and demonic. But the stage itself is a theater of the wild, in the winsome wiles of older modes of storying the struggle. And not atypically, the tease of the telling may well feature agents and events as unlikely as a saving fish or a grieving cow, or shape-shifting rabbit or cavorting raven closer to our Turtle Island context. In our most immediate moment, it is a black net that protested a white knee and a half-living virus leaking from upside-down hanging bats that have shaken a globalist economy and a supremacist state. If we have eyes to see, these are not crypto notes in the minutia of history, but the very signs of the divine in the only coin in which they're ever traded. Natural bodies deemed by the powers too insignificant to celebrate or quote. Bodies seemingly easily crushed and disappeared. But those insurgent afterlife haunts, but whose insurgent afterlife haunts our history and is capable of returning with profound consequence. The testament to such right now is living and real and summoning. It's asking of us a different world. Yeah. So, where do you want to go?
Question I'd love to hear you reflect on with us. Do you think that our system of capitalism can be reformed to conform to this vision of living within the world, or is it fundamentally and inherently colonialist?
Good question. I understand capitalism to be the unleashing on the planet over the course of the last 600 to 700 years of a force that answers to one value only: growth. The enshrinement of maximizing shareholder return at the expense of anything else. Legally, that's what we've mandated corporations to be. They're not legal creatures. We don't ask them legally to be moral. We ask them to do one thing. Milton Friedman is very clear. Maximize shareholder return. The unleashing of an infinite appetite on a finite plate is a formula for starvation. And I think the issue today, both as a response to your question, but also the issue for us as a species, is are we that kind of species that can limit ourselves? Question of limits. We're damned though, no question about it. Cleverness, accumulation of knowledge, but we aren't so wise. I would understand wisdom to be about the recognition of the limits on everything. What the planet seems to want, this particular planet, for the last 4.5 billion years, what it seems to be cooking up is this thing called life. And what life is all about is biodiversity. It only happens in a flourishing of a whole bunch of different things together, every one of which is a limit on all of the others. It's a network of genius where each creature is accepting the limitations imposed on it by all the other creatures. And when one creature, for whatever reason, decides, no, it's all about us, we're taking over. We're going to eat everything. We're going to consume all the energy, pull all that every other creature needs into our body. What happens is the planet crashes. And that's what our species has been doing since the invention of agriculture. Until then, we lived in small-scale band societies of about 150 or less, sometimes coming together seasonally in bigger gatherings to cross marry and do ritual, but nonetheless, adapting themselves to their local ecologies, not asking the local ecology to adapt to them. And then we started re-engineering plants, clearing the field, holocaust for all the other plants except the wheat or the rye or the oats or the sorghum or the corn we wanted to grow there. Takes a lot of work to maintain that because wild nature comes back in and wants the diversity. You have to keep killing off the diversity. And that grain staple is then an invasive in collaboration with another invasive called us that takes over. But it's ultimately not sustainable. So I think as long as capital is structured as it is, that is to say, in corporate form, enshrining growth at all costs, which the cell in the human body locks into the imperative of growth and begins ricocheting around the body, converting all the other cells into its logic and imperative. What do we call it?
Cancer.
Cancer. That's exactly what I think the corporate-driven, globalized neoliberal economy is on the planet. It's converting everything into its way of living, but ultimately it will decimate the host body and collapse. So can it be reformed? I mean, I'd like you to run for president, Brendan, and just have one platform that you're going to rewrite the law about what capitalism is so that corporations are allowed to exist like they were in the Middle Ages for, what, 2 years to do a particular project and then go out of existence.
I think the campaign would get there. How about those of the moment? Because they're spending one for.
But what to do? So all I know to do, I don't have an easy answer, and I don't have, frankly, a lot of hope in our capacity to deal with ourselves. I think wild nature is dealing with us. And that's okay. When I listen to indigenous cultures, they're not all hung up on preserving their own life because they don't understand their life to be bounded by their own bodies or their own species form. Their ancestors, when they die, become the new corn stalk, become the stream, become the locust tree, become the waters of the river winding its way through their watershed. And they recognize those beings as themselves, every bit as much as what's in this human container called an upright body. I'm a bipedal sack of water, basically. And so are you, except when I've eaten a lot, then I'm bipedal sack of that actually, when I poop out, is food for other plants. And I'm addicted to the defecation of plants. I take in plant food about every 3 or 4 seconds through my nostrils, and then it comes back out. There is no such thing as garbage. Everything's use of something else and then not holding on to it, privatizing and keeping it in their body. But defecating it becomes food for another creature and another species. Well, we've created this thing called the corporation, where in the colonial venture to attract investment, we created the limitation on the liability side. We never limited the asset side. That's like taking a human being and saying, you can no longer poop, but you can eat. What will happen?
Until your intestines explode, you're good now.
Yes.
A number of authors have presented the idea that human consciousness is shifting. There have been some surveys done some years back, about 22% related to the idea that they had a spiritual experience that linked them to nature, given, kind of the impact of the consciousness. And now it's recently 49%, having that kind of experience. And many authors say, if there's anything that's going to sort of save the planet, it is the shift in consciousness that you ultimately lay out. And others kind of maybe lay out in a more kind of structured way. One book of that, I think the other book that is Dwayne Elton, Choosing Earth. And a deep choice with the shift in consciousness supporting it.
And I don't want to gainsay that. I mean, I'm encouraged with that as far as it goes, but my reading of a lot of that discourse is it's still basically modernist, still really hoping that this project is going to find a way to survive. When I would say, we don't need a shift of consciousness. We already have the consciousness called indigenous culture. Our ancestors for 3 million years knew how to do this thing in a way that didn't destroy the environment. They're still around and they're speaking everywhere. We 95% genocidally eliminated them from the top of Canada to the bottom of Argentina as Euro-colonialism rolled through starting in 1492. But there's 5% that's still around all over the place. And they're speaking and they talk not about shifting consciousness, not about revolution. Some of them use that word, but basically what they're talking about is recovering what they already knew, what their ancestors knew. In this particular indigenous domain, you have the 7-5 prophecy of the Anishinaabe people. And they would say, we are in the 7th fire, and the way forward is, there are 2 paths. One that's utterly charred, burned out, dystopia of extinction and death. The other is a green, growing way forward with life. And they would say, the issue is, can we go back along the path and recover what we lost so we can go forward in the direction of life and greenness rather than Holocaust and extinction. And so I'm fine with, yes, consciousness is shifting for those of us who need that shift. But I would want to push on it to shift in the direction of stopping looking always to the future and to some kind of way of keeping us going, but to say, who are the people who know how to live right where I stand now? How do I get into relationship to them? Not in a way that says, will you please save me? But just goes to them and as a humble servant says, I'm sorry we've genocidally decimated you. Is there anything I can do that would be of service to you? And then listen. It takes a lot of time for native folk to trust folk that look like me. They're not going to immediately probably embrace you. Yes, Jim.
Thanks for this. The more reading I do, the more it seems that power and dominance, capitalism follows power and dominance, overtaking subsistence farming kinds of cultures. Is there anything in your knowledge story where you've read about that in reverse. What we're just talking about right now. We want to reverse it. You know, any examples of it ever happened?
Yes, I do think there are some examples around of indigenous cultures that went the direction of a more aggrandizing and dominating way of relating to each other in the natural world, and then backed off. The Anasazi out west, apparently. There's some Hopi who would go up into Chocolate Canyon and talk about, we built this, but then our spirits told us this was a wrong choice and backed away. I mean, that's one reading of it. Another reading of it is that climate change made it impossible to live at Chocolate Canyon. And I'm not an expert on any of that. I'm just relating the off the cuff in relationship to what you're saying. But I think there are examples, various places around the globe, where apparently people were able to back up and do some recovering on a local scale. The question is, when you've got a planet of 8 billion, where now the studies that have been done will say the average minimal amount of distance food needs to travel to feed everybody on the planet is 1,367 miles. What does that mean? Well, it means that we've got so many people now living in cities and megacities surrounded by hinterlands that can't support them. Even if they go local with their food initiatives, it will be impossible to feed them. They're going to have to import food from at least this far away, on average, is 1,367 miles. And so part of the problem is there's another piece of this. The paleontology database project has been looking at local ecosystems over the last 475 million years, basically 500 million years. And their research is saying the way life organizes itself so far in the history of the planet is in terms of local bioregions whose boundaries are determined by water. They're called watersheds. Water doesn't ever move in a straight line unless it's coerced to. Its movement is vortexual. It moves like a serpent across the landscape. But that determines how life happens in any given local watershed. It can be savanna, it can be rainforest, it can be even desert or mountain or maritime. And this database project turns out that the relationship in any given ecosystem is organized by what's called trophic scaling laws. Trophic is a word for eating, Greek word for eating. It's organized by who's eating. And the larger body you are, the less numbers of you there are. And you're eating smaller bodied, and this is true both of animals and ultimately of plants, because they're eating too, in the sense of pulling up and nurturing. Although they're amazing because they're the only autotrophs, the only ones who can take sunlight and water and crushed rock and make life. No other creature can do that. Right? We're all dependent on plants. When Isaiah says all flesh is grass, that's literally true. All the animals are dependent on the plants. Fine. But these trophic scaling laws that organize every given local ecosystem on the planet are organized in terms of the bigger body you are, the less of you there are. The smaller body you are, the more of you there are. Species come and go, but the niches stay in a stable, balanced relationship with each other based on this eating relationship until humans started agriculture in a major way. And it seems like for the last 6,000 years, when we started doing serious monocropping, we started agriculture before that, but did it for 4,000 or 5,000 years, small scale subsistence, combining hunting and gathering and small scale pastoralism with it in ways that were still largely sustainable. But then we went the direction of the city-state monocropping, elites, forcing everybody else to generate surplus they live off of. That kind of agriculture seems to be an initiative on the part of our species to exempt ourselves from these trophic scaling laws. And so we are way out of scale in terms of numbers of us on the planet, given our body size. What the F do we do? I don't have an answer. It means that from a natural point of view, we are set up for a great big dive.
We've got time for about one more question. But you hit up on something I was thinking about. Population is literally double 6 billion, 8 billion, that's time. And I just wonder about the sustainability of that. There's all action ways to say, well, don't do nothing about it, it's gonna take care of itself eventually. I just hope we're gonna cover that, but it looks like, you know, if the way the road is going, I guess it's not gonna be sustainable.
So again, I don't know what to do. There are two things I would say in relationship to it. One is I pay attention to what indigenous folk are saying, and what they're saying is we want the land back. We can't be ourselves. We can't live without the land. We're all dependent on land. And we're returning to the land and trying to recover what our ancestors knew about how to live on it. And so I listen to that. That's basically what they say. They say that's the answer. So my wife and I are trying in small ways to do that, to learn some of those skills, but almost anything we do perpetuates the white supremacist colonial camping out on somebody else's land that all of us are doing. Welcome to the contradiction in one moment. The second thing I would say is, again, I'm trying to face into the fact that I'm going to die. Our species is going to go extinct. It's not a question of is that going to happen? It's a question of when. Can we get okay with that? To understand that I am composed of all kinds of creatures. I'm a minority in my own body. You know, so there are probably 10 times the number of bacteria cells in my body than there are Jim Perkinson cells. Right? I'm a little ecosystem that is also a cemetery. The idea that life and death are abstractions. You can't really separate them from each other in reality. Something's living as something else is dying. I'm metabolizing other life forms as I'm standing here to be. And if I stop being that sort of cemetery for those other life forms, I will die and enter into another creature's body. My life is composed of a little bit of iron, a little bit of copper that really came from supernova stars. I'm eating plants and animals. I'm more than 60% water. I take in air that's being breathed by all the plants and all the animals on the planet for all of time. I'm probably taking in a molecule of Julius Caesar as I'm up here talking. Here it is, right? Okay. But anyway, thank you. And my body is a temporary composition of all of those creatures that have had incredible histories before they became me. They're going to have incredible histories after me. I don't have to choose to just identify with this. I can identify myself with the ongoing, amazing, wondrous, terrifying, fierce streams of energy that are this universe of more than, well, the estimates now are somewhere between 10 and 20 trillion galaxies, each composed with 150 or billion stars, give or take, 1 or 2. And ricocheting out and away from this thing called Big Bang for the last 13.7 billion years, and against all our understanding, about 5 billion years into that, explosion out, instead of slowing down and coming back together as gravity would dictate, it's sped up. It's going nobody knows where. So we invent this thing called dark energy, dark matter to explain what's happening to us. We really don't know. The universe is incredible. Just unfathomable. And I've got 380 trillion viruses riding in my body right now, and 38 trillion bacteria. What am I? Viruses were probably the original multicultural exchange agents. Parting material from one cell to another cell that resulted in the biodiversity. So I don't want to just eliminate viruses. When they get hooked up with our political system, they get racialized and become part of killing off of people of color. I don't want to fight against that, but not against viruses themselves. We need them. They are us. So anyway, that's what I would end.
Dr. Perkinson, thank you. We expected nothing less. And thank all of you for being here at this inaugural lecture of our faculty lecture series. We hope to see you again February 22nd, Wednesday at noon, for Dr. Bell's lecture on theological aesthetics. If you are hoping to get out into this middle list, please make sure you sign up before you head out the door. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much for spending your time. So,
There is a wonderful practice. Very engaging. That is in reference to choosing your, very much in line with Dr. Perkinson's